Welcome to Conspiracist. Today, we're diving into a pretty significant hypothesis, the idea that governments might have intentionally concealed scientific evidence. We've got quite a range of sources in front of us, things like data on public trust, legal frameworks, case studies.
Right.
Our goal here is really to explore the evidence and the reasoning behind this hypothesis. We'll try to stay objective, analytical throughout.
Absolutely. It's definitely a topic with many, many layers. And these sources, they offer different perspectives, different angles to think about it. We need to look carefully at what each piece tells us about this possibility, this idea of intentional government concealment in science.
Okay, so where should we start? Maybe with the context. We have some research center data showing that public trust in scientists in the U.S., well, it goes up and down.
Yeah, it fluctuates.
How does that fluctuating trust, or maybe lack of stable trust, connect to this idea of governments hiding things?
Well, you could think of it like this. If the public's trust in scientific institutions isn't rock solid, if it's variable, then people might be, shall we say, more open to believing stories that suggest these institutions, including government bodies involved in science, aren't being completely upfront.
Oh, okay. So it creates fertile ground.
Sort of, yeah. It creates a space where the idea of hiding things, of intentional concealment, just seems more believable, maybe more plausible to some, even if there's no direct proof, you know? So fluctuating trust doesn't prove secrecy, but it definitely shapes how receptive people might be to those kinds of claims.
That makes sense, like a backdrop almost. And building on that, there's a discussion paper we looked at about science disinformation. It talks about how hard it is to tell, facts from fake stuff.
Right, the signal from the noise.
Exactly. And it mentions that even though people know disinformation is harmful, there isn't really a big coordinated effort, say, in Europe to fight it. How does that issue connect to potential government secrecy?
Well, the whole struggle with science disinformation, it highlights this bigger problem we have with information integrity in general, doesn't it? So claims about government hiding scientific facts could sometimes be a type of deliberate disinformation, aiming to erode trust in science, in the government's use of science. And the fact that there isn't this, united front against disinformation generally could make it easier for specific narratives, like government secrecy ones, to take root and spread.
Okay, and that same paper, it points to specific areas where disinformation is rife, like climate change or vaccine safety.
Yes, those are prominent examples.
And it mentions motivations behind it, like economic interests in fossil fuels for climate denial or political polarization.
Right.
Could those kinds of motivations, economic, political, also drive a government to suppress or maybe distort science?
It's certainly conceivable, isn't it? I mean, the motivations that fuel disinformation from other sources, money, politics, wanting to avoid difficult policy changes, those same pressures could, theoretically, push a government body towards hiding or twisting scientific information.
So if a finding had big economic impacts for an industry or contradicted a political narrative.
Exactly. The incentive to downplay it or maybe even classify it might exist, but, and this is crucial, we always have to distinguish potential motives from proven actions. It's easy to speculate about motives.
Sure. Motive is an action. Which actually brings us to a really interesting part of our material. We have information from a concerned scientists group presenting case studies. These are from roughly 2001 to 2009.
I remember looking at those.
And they allege specific instances where the U.S. government supposedly interfered with science. Things like deleting scientific advice, controlling what government scientists could communicate, ignoring studies that were politically inconvenient, even distorting scientific knowledge in agencies like the EPA, CDC, NASA, places like that. These seem like direct accusations.
They are, and these case studies are really important because they shift the discussion from the purely theoretical to specific concrete allegations. These are claims of government agencies actively suppressing or altering science, potentially for non-scientific reasons.
Right.
Now, if these allegations hold water, they offer tangible examples of the kind of interference we're discussing today.
Like deleting advice that sounds pretty deliberate?
It could certainly indicate an effort to ignore evidence that goes against a preferred policy, yes. Or controlling scientists' communications that might suggest trying to manage the public story around certain issues. Of course, we have to treat them as allegations that need scrutiny, but they definitely give us concrete points to consider.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit to the idea of secrecy itself. We found a historical note, quite old actually, from a 1947 Atomic Energy Commission memo.
Ah, yes, the post-war era.
And it apparently suggested classifying documents about human experiments. But the reason given wasn't just national security. It was to avoid, quote, adverse public opinion or legal suits.
That is quite revealing, isn't it?
It seems so. It suggests a reason for government secrecy beyond protecting military secrets.
Exactly. It shows that even way back then, government bodies considered classifying scientific information essentially for PR reasons or to avoid legal trouble, not strictly for national security in the traditional sense. And that fits into broader discussions about how secrecy might be used for reasons other than just protecting against foreign threats. It makes you wonder what other science might get classified for reasons that aren't about, safeguarding the nation.
And on that note, we have material from a project focused on government secrecy, outlining the legal framework for classified information in the U.S.
Right, the formal rules.
It highlights that the president has a lot of authority in setting the standards for what gets classified, and that these standards can change from one administration to the next.
That variability is key.
But the framework also includes ways to declassify information and sometimes congressional oversight. What does this legal structure tell us about the potential for hiding science?
Well, it tells us that government secrecy isn't arbitrary. There's a defined process, rules, authorities. But the fact that standards can shift with different presidents introduces, flexibility or maybe potential inconsistency in what stays secret.
Okay.
And while there are processes for declassification and oversight, how effective they are, how much scope they have, that's often debated. So this legal framework is the structure within which any decision to classify scientific information would happen. Its flexibility and how it's interpreted are really important factors.
But that same project also raises flags about potential misuse of the system.
Yes, that's a significant concern.
Suggesting that maybe information that isn't truly vital for national security still ends up getting classified. It even mentions tensions, like between the executive branch wanting control over information and Congress wanting oversight. Yeah. Could that be a route for scientific information, stuff not really about national security, to get hidden away?
That's a critical point, absolutely. The concerns about misuse imply that the classification system could be used, whether intentionally or not, to keep things under wraps that don't meet the classic national security test.
So if some scientific data was just politically awkward, or maybe embarrassing for the government?
Theoretically, yes.
Yeah.
The existing classification framework could potentially be invoked to limit public access to that information, even if it poses no direct security threat. And that tension you mentioned between the executive wanting secrecy and the legislature wanting transparency, that just adds another layer of complexity to ensuring things are open.
Okay, one more angle. An article from an investigative journalism network focused on open science and research fraud.
Research integrity issues.
Yeah. It points out that there's often not enough oversight on how research data is collected and analyzed, even for projects funded by the government.
A definite vulnerability.
And it suggests things like pre-registering studies and using data receipts to improve transparency. How does this fit into our discussion about government concealment?
Well, that article highlights weaknesses within the scientific process itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
If there isn't strong oversight on data collection and analysis, even in government-funded research, that could potentially open the door for findings to be intentionally manipulated or hidden. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be directed by the government as a whole, maybe by individuals or institutions, but the vulnerability exists.
So better transparency measures could help prevent that.
Exactly. Things like pre-registration, making data openly available. They aim to boost accountability right at the research level. That could act as a safeguard against both honest mistakes and any deliberate attempt to distort or conceal scientific results. It makes hiding things harder.
Okay, so we've covered quite a bit of ground here, looking at trust, disinformation, motivations, specific allegations, historical examples, legal frameworks, research integrity. When we try to synthesize all this, what are the main takeaways about this hypothesis of intentional government concealment of science?
It's definitely a nuanced picture that emerges. I mean, on one hand, you have those specific allegations from the scientist group. If accurate, they show government actions that did seem to suppress or distort science.
Right, concrete examples, even if contested.
And that historical memo from the Atomic Energy Commission shows that hiding science for non-security reasons isn't a new idea. It's been contemplated before. Plus, the concerns about the classification system possibly being misused suggest a potential mechanism, a way non-security information could be hidden. But on the other hand, none of these sources provide, slam-dunk proof of some vast systematic conspiracy to hide science across the board in all fields.
So it looks like we've found potential motives, some historical precedents, maybe some mechanisms through which government-related concealment could happen. But just because those elements exist doesn't automatically mean there's some massive, deliberate cover-up going on everywhere.
Precisely. What this exploration really underscores is, well, the need for critical thinking, the importance of transparency in science itself. And it highlights that ongoing tension between government interests, whatever they may be, and the public's right to access information. These sources really push us to stay vigilant, to be discerning when we hear claims about governments intentionally hiding scientific truth. We need to ask for evidence.
A complex issue indeed. And thanks for walking us through these different facets with such a clear, objective lens.
It's a necessary discussion, I think, especially when we're talking about the integrity of scientific information and public trust.
Thanks for listening to Conspiracist.